A young man wakes up in the ruins of post-apocalyptic Tokyo, and not before long, demons threaten to take his life. All of a sudden, a ball of energy appears and strikes the ground, revealing a muscular humanoid clad in armor. He rises up and reaches his hand out to the young man, saying, "If you wish to live, take my hand." Ever since this scene played out in the original Shin Megami Tensei V, I couldn't help but be reminded of the famous scene in Terminator 2 Judgment Day, where T-800 offers his hand to Sarah Connor, along with John Connor, uttering the line, "Come with me if you want to live." As someone who grew up in the 90s, exposed to the Terminator series and Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, I found the possible reference quite amusing, but I never really thought back on it until recently, way after finishing the Vengeance release of SMTV, which came out in June of 2024. If you've been following my channel, I've been doing cut content, data mining theory, news discussion, and freecam videos where I examine SMT5 more closely. What's so strange about this game is it always feels like I'm finding something new the more I keep dissecting it, even long after its original release. During some examination of the game using the Unreal Engine 4 freecam, I came across more things I didn't really think on too much before that might be references to the Terminator series in relation to the Protofiends, especially Agami. Even something that might actually explain how the Protofiend bodies work, depending on how much from the Terminator series lore the devs of SMT5 might actually be referencing. So what are Protofiends? If you haven't played the game and are watching this video for some reason, the Protofiends that are talked about in SMT5 tend to be android-like beings that house the essence of a demon. Demons that have to be tied to the Amanozako of Japanese mythology. The one we're shown the most of in the game is a mass-produced combat unit called Agami, who contains the essence of Susanoo. In the Japanese version of SMT5, they are referred to as Shinzo Majin, or God-created demons. They're artificially created demons with some divine involvement, you could say, even though humans also have a part in their development process. Now, keep in mind when I'm discussing or pointing these things out, there's always a chance everything is just really coincidental and not a reference, and then a lot of this is just theorizing on my part, but let us go onward. And if you happen to come across things in the game that you also think are Terminator references, please leave a comment down below. When Agami first appears to the protagonist in SMT5, he shows up as a ball of electricity that shoots down to the ground, and after the smoke clears, he's kneeling to the ground at first and then stands up. A very well-known method for the Terminator units to appear in the Terminator series is by electricity, which tends to affect or hit things around it. And then after the smoke clears, they tend to be in a kneeled pose before rising up. In fact, the exact position that T-800 is in when he arrives, with one leg up and one leg kneeled, a fist to the ground and head facing downward, is the same position that Agami appears in before standing up. In Terminator 2 specifically, compared to Terminator 1, T-800 raises his head before standing up, and we're shown a ball of energy much like Agami's before he arrives. And of course I mentioned the line very similar to what T-800 utters when holding out his hand, so I think it's safe to say that this is as direct as it gets for references. Now, much like the T-800 units in the Terminator series, they also tend to share the same physical appearance, and are able to gain some form of independence. The Agami units can develop unique combat abilities over time, develop emotions, and learn to understand human concepts. Now, it's hard to know what the other Agami units were like, ones that had fallen in battle prior to the events of SMT5, as the main Agami we know had his programming tampered by Lucifer 18 years ago during the Great War. So, in a way, you could compare Lucifer's tampering of Agami to allow him to gain independence from Bethel, and also allow him to fuse with the protagonist to become a Nahobino, similar to a T-800 having its more advanced abilities enabled, also allowing it to gain independence from Skynet and to become more human-like. Now, for Protofiend body composition, this is going to get confusing as we're referring to Terminator lore, because the series is known for having a variety of units where their capabilities may depend on the materials used in their construction. It's been gnawing me at the back of my mind about the way the Agami husks specifically look. It's different from the statues of petrified demons you find around that give you level up bonuses. The outer appearance of the husks have a silver reflective look to it, which, when I actually spent time to think about it, reminded me of the Terminator units later in the series that either utilized a layer of or were entirely comprised of a liquid metal-like substance called Mimetic Polyalloy. I never fully examined the Algami husk before, so at first glance, aside from the strange reflective surface on the bodies, they seem very solid, rock-like even, in areas where damage was sustained or things like limbs were missing. So I assumed, aside from the Magatsuei that fills their bodies and is usually visible if they're active, that the rest of the body might have been similar to the mannequins of Nocturne, where they were made of some mixture of earth-like materials, but obviously more resilient. There have been many theories about the internal structure of the Algami units since the original version of SMT5, and since they appear to be android-like, many have assumed they might have mechanical parts internally, or might have a mixture of artificially created biological components and mechanical ones. If we make comparisons to the variety of androids that exist in science fiction and their compositions, it's quite a rabbit hole. Even for the Terminator series, the earliest combat models, the T-800, had a surface of living skin over a solid endoskeleton. However, recently I noticed something interesting about the Algami husk that I didn't really pay attention to much before. When you get really close to a husk, you may see particles coming off the bodies and dissipating. If they still have an essence in them to be obtained, they may have these sparks of light. But what also seems to be present are silver liquid-like blobs floating off the body and then disappearing. A silver liquid that reminds me of the Mimetic Polyalloy of the later Terminator units in the Terminator series, such as the T-1000, T-1001, TX, and any other models that may be entirely comprised of the alloy or use a combination of a solid frame and liquid metal. Now, Mimetic Polyalloy in the Terminator series allows units to take on the appearance and behaviors of a human, can be programmable and retain data, can allow the shape-shifting of limbs into weapons such as sharp blades, and can be used to repair and heal the body, but the extent of that healing depends on the type of damage and what the full composition of the body is. If the devs took inspiration from the Terminator series, it may give some clue how the Protofiend bodies work beyond what we know in the game. We also have to keep in mind that compared to the Terminator units, Protofiends are artificial demons, and are not just bodies with programmed artificial components, but contain Magatsuei, a form of energy that powers and sustains demons in the SMT series, and the essence of a demon itself. It's possible that beyond programming, the Magatsuei is what is necessary to maintain and power the bodies of Protofiends. This demonic essence may further enhance the artificial properties of their bodies as well. With the silvery look of the husks, I theorize that by either losing too much power or taking severe damage, they may lose the ability to maintain some of their appearance over time. And if the bodies have been debilitated, exposed to the elements of Dot, their outer appearance may have also worn down over time, revealing this metal-looking substance underneath. The crystal rock-like look of the husk is hard to explain, especially if the substance they are made of is not meant to be exactly like that of the units in the Terminator series, but I hope we get a design book that actually goes over more details in the future. I do know that in SMT5 itself, Magatsuei is capable of crystallizing, and also likely a reference or a different version of magnetite, which is a substance from earlier in the SMT series that acts as the data and building blocks of all physical and metaphysical things. Magnetite is capable of existing in a crystal-like state or in a liquid form, and the other reason I bring it up is typically it tends to appear in a green color, at least earlier in the SMT series. So I also wondered if the green liquid in the bioexperiment pool area where the essences of the Amatsukami are kept were used in the development process of the artificial bodies for the Protofiends as well, and not just an essence that defines who they are and gives them special abilities. The way the liquid is used to possibly repair Algami's body and read data from him reminds me of the Mimetic Polyalloy, but without a design book and more details, it's kind of hard to say for sure. I will say though, going back to the possible reference of the Mimetic Polyalloy, if it does indeed draw from it as an inspiration, it may explain how Tsukuyomi, or also known as Hayao Koshimizu, who is also a Protofiend and acted as the template for Algami, is able to maintain a very convincing human appearance. An interesting thing to mention as well is that Tsukuyomi, compared to Algami, is a logistics unit working in two positions of command, but was not meant for combat. There are units in the Terminator series like T-1000 and T-1001 that act more like infiltrator units instead of purely for combat. And T-1001 especially was capable of acting in the role of a CEO for a corporation in place of a human, being able to manage and command things by itself. Though these units are not focused on combat and have the same resilience, they do have the ability to shapeshift, form weapons on limbs if need be, and use a combination of intelligence, deception, and evasion to get what they need to be done. In the Vengeance route, Tsukuyomi copies data from Aogami and fuses with the protagonist to become the Nahobino. Though he is a logistics unit, he is able to carry out combat even though researchers comment that his body is wearing down quickly over time. And if you examine the Tsukuyomi essences after becoming an Nahobino, you'll notice that they actually focus on speed, illusion, and evasive abilities instead of purely just for combat. One more thing I'll mention about Tsukuyomi, but before it was fully revealed that he was a Protofiend, I suspected that he may have had an artificial origin like Aogami in the creation route or original version of SMT5, because the Nahobino form of Tsukuyomi has very similar attributes to the armor of the protagonist's Nahobino form, which contains some aspects of Aogami. This is true for the new Nahobino form in Vengeance as well, which has similar features, and we know that Aogami's body used Tsukuyomi as a template, so it's possible that Tsukuyomi's true body looks like a logistics-type version of Aogami's body before he was forced to take on a human disguise to serve as the Prime Minister and Director of Bethel, Japan. Another possible reference, and I do think this might be a stretch, but I found it interesting anyways, is that later in the Terminator series, a unit referred to as T-3000 is what you could call a fusion of a human and a machine. In Terminator Genesis, John Connor is converted to a machine through an infection of a nanomachine-based substance. And the substance is so advanced it has far greater capabilities than the Mimetic Polyalloy, being able to mimic biological parts and even fluids at a cellular level. And it has greater healing abilities and more. So in some ways I was kind of reminded of the Nahobino fusion of the protagonist and Aogami. There's still one more Protofiend I'd like to mention that I think the comparison to the Mimetic Polyalloy would help explain a little bit, and that is Amanozako. We aren't told this directly, if I recall, but it's suggested that Amanozako comes from the parts of a fallen Aogami unit that the Tengu put together. The Tengu wanted to create a great Tengu to lead them, so somehow they required the information on how Protofiends are created, ripped off some parts of an Aogami husk, and then created a Amanozako with them. I'm sure people wondered how parts of an Aogami body could look like this little flying girl, but if the substance the Protofiends are made of is capable of being reshaped and also defined by what essence is shoved into them, then it might explain how something like limbs from an Aogami unit, as an example, could become something like a Amanozako. We don't know which Aogami unit she was made from, but if we make comparisons to the Mimetic Polyalloy from the Terminator series, the substance is capable of retaining data of any forms it was taken previously, and if separated from the body, it may try to rejoin its body, or maybe something similar to the body it used to be a part of. Now, earlier in the game, Amanozako becomes attached to you, the protagonist, and claims that as a Nahobino is meant to be your soulmate. But later on she reveals it's actually because of the Protofiend that the protagonist is now a part of, Aogami. Lore-wise, Amanozako is supposed to be the daughter of the Japanese god Susanoo, who created her after he vomited out his violent emotions. You could say that this is a very unique way of demonstrating this lore. As a final thing, I don't think this is a direct reference to the Terminator series, but with Terminator on the mind, I was reminded of it anyways after playing SMT5 Vengeance, but there's a scene where the Nahobino gets sacrificed by the Kadishtu, and both the protagonist and Aogami are separated and floating away from each other in the void. And Aogami ends up sinking down into the darkness after pushing away the protagonist and out of Tiamat, so he doesn't get absorbed. And it kind of reminded me of the scene In Terminator 2 Judgment Day, when T-800 decides to sacrifice himself for the sake of humanity, allowing himself to be lowered into a vat, like a smelting vat, and melting away, and he slowly sinks down, and of course, this is a very sad scene because the young John Connor and Sarah Connor don't want him to go, and of course, like, John Connor is protesting and trying to do whatever he can to stop T-800 from killing himself, basically. Of course, the funny thing is just like Terminator, T-800 that isn't the only time we see T-800, and we know that T-800, just like Agami, ends up coming back. I hope you enjoyed me going over the comparisons and theories in relation to these possible references. And like I mentioned in the beginning, if there are any other points I may have missed in relation to the Terminator series, please leave me a comment down below, and thanks for watching.